The world has long been captivated by the figure of the pirate. Popular culture has polished their image into something almost playful. A reckless outlaw, humorous, with rum in hand and a hidden sense of honor. But the reality, especially during what historians call the golden age of piracy, was far more cruel. Behind the romanticized tales of buried treasure and heroic battles stood a grim reality, filled with blood, brutality, and the forgotten pain of the voiceless. Among those who suffered the worst were boys, young, often powerless, caught on the wrong ship at the wrong moment. They were not just accidental victims of pirate raids. Many were specifically taken, abused, and turned into tools or toys for ruthless men who ruled the seas with terror. This is not a story told for amusement. It is spoken for truth, and for those whose suffering was lost in the silence of history. The pirate world was ruled by violence. To understand the fate of these boys, one must first step into the world in which piracy thrived. The so-called Golden Age of piracy stretched from about 1650 to 1730. During this time, the Atlantic Ocean became a hunting ground for ex-naval men, escaped convicts, displaced colonists, and others pushed to the edge of empire. The Caribbean, the coast of West Africa, and even the shores of North America swarmed with pirate vessels, each a floating community with its own rules and customs. Contrary to common belief, pirate ships were not simply lawless chaos. They often lived under pirate codes, written agreements that set rules for the crew. These codes dictated how treasure would be shared, how disputes were resolved, and how loyalty was judged. Captains could be voted out. Cowards might lose an ear. Injured men were sometimes compensated with shares of gold. In many ways, it was a strange form of democracy at sea. But these rights applied only to the pirates themselves. For outsiders, for captives, there was no law, no justice, no protection. Prisoners were regarded as resources to be used or objects to be destroyed. Boys were especially vulnerable. Their youth made them obedient, their small size suited for the hardest labor, and their voices easy to ignore. When pirates attacked merchant or naval ships, they did not only take gold and gunpowder, they also took people. Strong men might be forced to join the crew, often under threat of death. Women, when present, faced their own horrors. But for boys under 15, youth was not protection. In many cases, it condemned them. The most common fate for these boys was forced service. Many became cabin boys, attendants for the ship's officers, trapped in lives of fear, hardship, and submission. They were expected to rise before the crew and rest only after them, to obey every order without hesitation, and to endure each insult, blow, or command thrown at them. Some were forced into duties such as cook's helpers or powder monkeys, the latter being a task that demanded carrying heavy bags of gunpowder across cramped, smoke-filled decks during battle. It was dangerous, exhausting, and often deadly. There are reports of boys who collapsed from fatigue and were whipped where they lay. One Jamaican court record from 1718 tells of a boy who was beaten nearly to death for dropping a rope into the sea, an act judged as incompetence rather than an accident. The punishment was so brutal that witnesses swore he never fully recovered consciousness. On pirate vessels, there were no doctors, no care, only silence or the sea. Unspoken horrors. Even worse were crimes that history has hesitated to name openly. Sexual abuse on pirate ships is a subject rarely addressed in histories, but it appears between the lines of court evidence and testimonies. Few records directly state such acts, due to the taboos and censorship of the age, yet phrases like used for pleasure, kept in the captain's cabin, or subject to indecency appear often enough to leave chilling implications. Some boys simply disappeared after being taken aboard, with no further mention in records or interrogations. Others were discovered hiding below decks, too terrified to speak. The imbalance of power was absolute. A child surrounded by hardened, armed men in the middle of the ocean had no choice, no protection, no way out. Even when not sexually harmed, many boys were subjected to humiliation and psychological torment. Pirates distrusted outsiders deeply. New captives, especially those taken by force, were often put through brutal rites of initiation designed to break their will and force submission. Some were forced to watch other prisoners mutilated or executed. Others were flogged or ordered to perform degrading acts for the amusement of the crew. In one cruel practice, pirates abandoned boys on remote, deserted islands as a test of survival. If the boy managed to survive, living on rainwater, roots, or pure chance, he might be judged strong enough to return to the ship. If he died, his remains served as a warning to the next captive. Fear was the weapon. Life on a pirate ship revolved around control, and that control was maintained through terror. The fear instilled in boys was not accidental. It was deliberate. A terrified child would not resist, would obey more quickly, and could be exploited more easily. Some pirates kept boys in chains below decks for days, feeding them only when they remembered. Others tormented captives for amusement, suspending them upside down, dunking them in barrels of seawater, or pretending to throw them overboard before pulling them back. And this was not merely the cruelty of a few madmen. Whole crews took part, watched, or looked away. The torment of these boys was woven into the very pattern of pirate life. It was the grim cost of freedom, borne by the innocent, preserved in cruel legends and written in historical records of horror. The ordinary terrors of pirate life were already severe enough, but in some documented cases, the treatment of captured boys went beyond cruelty into a realm of shocking sadism. These were not simple punishments or the harsh conditions of living at sea. They were deliberate and extended violations of both body and soul, often carried out openly before pirate crews who either approved, took part, or chose silence. Certain pirate captains became notorious not only for their raiding and plundering, but also for their extreme, almost pathological brutality. The following examples, taken from testimonies, ship logs, and early histories, reveal this cruelty in precise and disturbing detail. Not every pirate was a monster, but some certainly were, and their reputations were fully earned. Edward Lowe, a name that made ships turn and flee. Edward Lowe's very name carried the weight of terror across the Atlantic. In the 1720s, Lowe rose to prominence as an English pirate who inspired panic, not only through his mercilessness in battle, but through the gruesome stories that followed in his wake. His cruelty, especially toward the defenseless, became legendary. One of the most disturbing accounts involving Edward Lowe appears in A General History of the Pirates, a source compiled by Captain Charles Johnson, a pseudonym many believe belonged either to Daniel Defoe or a contemporary of his. Johnson recorded an episode where Lowe seized a Portuguese vessel whose crew included several young boys. Instead of holding them for ransom or forcing them into service, Lowe turned their suffering into a spectacle. According to the account, Lowe lined up the captured crew, including the boys, and ordered that their ears be cut off. But the savagery did not end there. In a grotesque twist, he commanded them to eat the severed flesh, laughing as some gagged or fainted from the blood and the shock. One boy vomited after trying to eat, and was thrown into the sea for what was called disrespect. Lowe's abuse of young captives did not stop with mutilation. He was known to bind boys to the mast and lash them with a whip soaked in seawater, reopening every wound with each stroke. In other cases, he tied them and burned their skin with lit matches to test their strength. Some boys were turned into live targets for knife throwing, while others were drowned with weights fastened to their ankles, mere warnings to other prisoners who might think of defiance. His cruelty was not the result of haste or necessity. It was deliberate, rehearsed, and staged, and for boys unfortunate enough to be aboard the ships he attacked, it was the beginning of suffering beyond words. Terror maintained by fist and rope. While Edward Lowe practiced savage theatricality, Charles Vane relied on the cold logic of intimidation. A feared and powerful pirate of the early 18th century, Vane's reputation was built on relentless force and a refusal to compromise, even with his own crew. His methods were direct and horrifying. Vane believed obedience could be secured only through fear. When his ship captured a slave vessel near the West Indies, he made an example of the young cabin boy on board. The child, no older than 12 or 13, had been serving as a helper on the merchant vessel. Vane accused him, without evidence, of hiding information about the cargo. As punishment, the boy was stripped of his clothing and dragged before both crews. Vane beat him with a rope until he collapsed. Witnesses later testified that the blows continued even after the child had lost consciousness. He died 2 days later, writhing in agony, delirious, and ignored. This killing was not hidden. It was a demonstration. Vane hung the boy's shirt, stained with blood, from the rigging of the ship as a warning to every captive. Loyalty or death. It worked. The others obeyed, but the price was a child's life. Vane was also infamous for suspending young boys upside down from the mast or from hooks meant for cargo, leaving them hanging for hours under the burning sun. One survivor, who later testified at a pirate trial in Kingston, remembered being forced to watch as another boy was tied by the ankles, lowered again and again toward the sea, and held just above the waves to imitate drowning. The child begged for mercy, choking and twitching, while Vane calmly smoked his pipe and watched in silence. This was not war, not piracy, but psychological warfare directed against children. French buccaneers, torture in Hispaniola. Not every act of cruelty was the work of individual captains. At times, it was the shared practice of entire pirate crews. In the early 1700s, a band of French buccaneers attacked a Spanish merchant vessel near the coast of Hispaniola. Unlike many raids, this one was motivated less by gold and more by rumors. The French had heard whispers that the Spanish ship carried hidden treasure, silver bars supposedly stored in secret compartments. When no such treasure was found, the pirates turned to interrogation. Among the captives were several teenage boys, 2 of them employed in the cargo hold. The French believed these boys knew the location of the missing wealth. What followed was brutal torture. The boys were dragged to the deck, their shirts ripped from their backs, and irons brought from the galley. Eyewitnesses described how the pirates heated the rods until they glowed red, then pressed them against the boys' skin while shouting questions in French mixed with broken Spanish. The boys screamed and writhed, giving no answers, either because they truly did not know, or because pain stole their voices. One boy had his fingers cut off one by one. Another was branded across the face. The crew watched, some shouting jeers, others remaining silent. When it ended, 3 of the boys lay dead. The treasure was never discovered. The pirates left the next morning, abandoning the bodies to rot in the surf. The surviving boy was tied to the mast for the rest of the journey, left dirty, bleeding, and alone. Years later, he was found in Havana, mute and half-mad. The patterns emerge. These stories, dreadful as they are, reveal a chilling consistency. Pirate cruelty toward boys was not rare or accidental. It was systematic within certain corners of pirate society. Whether fueled by paranoia, rage, sadism, or the thrill of power, pirates, especially those without restraint or strong command, inflicted their worst abuses on the youngest captives aboard. For these boys, there was no mercy, no escape, and no justice. Their bodies became instruments of torment, their fear a source of amusement, their silence a currency among desperate men. And when they died, as many did, their stories faded like stains on a deck, washed by the sea, but never completely erased. Discipline and dread, the so-called orderly pirates. Not every pirate was a mindless sadist, and not every crew sank into chaos. Some captains thought of themselves as men of order, strategists not butchers, leaders not tyrants. Yet even among these supposedly disciplined figures, the treatment of captured boys remained cruel, dehumanizing, and often deadly. The structure changed, but the suffering did not. Among these orderly leaders, none was more infamous, or more paradoxically admired, than Bartholomew Roberts, remembered as Black Bart. Bartholomew Roberts' structure without mercy. Roberts began his pirate career in the early 18th century and quickly rose to command one of the strongest pirate fleets of his age. He became known for imposing strict discipline aboard his ships. Gambling and drinking were forbidden. Disputes among crew members had to be settled ashore. Even curfews were enforced. His pirate code was lengthy, detailed, and strictly observed. But structure was never the same as kindness. Roberts was pragmatic as well as powerful. He understood that to keep a ship working required men, and he cared little about how those men or boys were brought to serve him. Boys taken during raids were often forced into duty. Some were made cooks, Others became powder monkeys, child laborers ordered to carry gunpowder to the cannons in the middle of battle, a task both exhausting and deadly. One such boy, known only as Samuel in a 1721 court record from Cape Coast Castle, served aboard Robert's flagship for more than 2 years. He was 13 when he was taken from a merchant vessel near Sierra Leone. In his testimony, he described his first weeks on the pirate ship as nothing but hunger and violence. When he refused to polish the captain's boots, he was whipped with a rope until his skin bled. When he cried, they smeared tar inside his mouth to silence him. Samuel tried to escape 2 times, once by leaping overboard in a harbor and once by hiding in a storage compartment. Both times he was captured. For the second attempt, he was chained to a post on the upper deck and left under the burning sun for 2 days without food or water. His testimony ended with a chilling line, "I knew if I tried again, I would not live to regret it." Even though Roberts opposed certain kinds of excess, such as drunken violence, he never objected to the forced service of boys. Discipline was harsh, immediate, and merciless. Young captives were not treated as people but as tools, and if a tool broke or resisted, it was thrown away or punished without hesitation. John Phillips and the case of Thomas Nichols. Another pirate captain, John Phillips, operated with far less fame than Roberts or Lowe, but his deeds revealed the same cruelty that ran through pirate life. In 1724, Phillips captured a small ship off the coast of Newfoundland. On board that vessel was a 16-year-old boy named Thomas Nichols. Nichols was not a sailor. He had been traveling with his father, a carpenter, on a trading voyage. When the pirates stormed the ship, his father was beaten and abandoned, but Thomas was taken. According to court documents later used in Phillips' trial, Thomas was told he would either join the pirates or be thrown into the sea. At first, he refused. What followed was a punishment designed to break his will. His clothes were torn off, and he was tied to the mast, where crewmen took turns whipping him with knotted rope. When his back was cut raw, they poured salt water into the wounds to toughen him up, as one pirate reportedly said. Afterward, he was shackled in chains and kept in the ship's hold for a week. There was no bedding, no food, only a few gulps of water each day. By the week's end, he agreed to serve. The scars of his submission remained across his skin for the rest of his life. During his time with the pirates, Thomas was treated with constant contempt. He was struck when he spoke out of turn and mocked when he cried. When the ship stopped for supplies, he tried to call for help from a nearby settlement by setting a small fire on shore. The pirates discovered his attempt and struck him with the flat sides of their cutlasses until he lost consciousness. When Phillips was finally seized by a British naval patrol, Thomas Nichols stood in court and testified against him. His testimony was so vivid and distressing that it secured convictions for several members of the crew. Nichols had spent less than a year aboard, but the ordeal had aged him far beyond his years. By the time he appeared before the judges, he was 17, but carried himself like a man twice his age. Not all pirates, but far too many. It would be unfair to claim that every pirate crew committed violence against boys. Some captains permitted young captives to work under watch with little abuse. Records exist of boys who were spared entirely, and even rare accounts of children being shielded by pirates who found them useful or endearing. But these were exceptions rather than the common pattern. The treatment of boys shifted from ship to ship, shaped by the character of the captain, the mood of the crew, or the traditions they followed. A French crew might practice brutal interrogations. An English captain might keep strict discipline without open displays of savagery. Spanish or Portuguese pirates sometimes showed mercy wrapped in religion, at least outwardly, but when discipline was demanded or vengeance taken, boys were often among the first to feel the blows. What united these various crews was not a single code of cruelty but a shared indifference to suffering. To many pirates, captives were not human beings but symbols. Symbols of fear, examples for others, or pawns to be exchanged for provisions. Boys, because of their age and weakness, were the easiest symbols to manipulate. They could be beaten to make a point, displayed to enforce terror, or discarded the moment they ceased to be of use. The silence surrounding their stories. Unlike grown men who sometimes recorded their ordeals or testified in court, Most boys captured by pirates never had the chance to share their voices. Many perished at sea. Others were abandoned in ports, too broken to speak or too afraid of the consequences if they tried. Some drifted back into society, their scars hidden beneath clothing and silence. Even in records, their identities are missing. They appear only as a boy, a lad, or the cabin servant. Their lives are preserved only in fragments. Trial notes, brief mentions, letters from naval officers or missionaries who repeated what they had heard. Yet even fragments allow us to assemble the larger truth. The suffering of these boys is not always written directly. Sometimes it hides in pauses, in euphemisms, in the shadows of the documents. But it is present, clear and undeniable to those willing to read. The human cost and its legacy. By now, the shape of the truth cannot be denied. The supposed freedom of pirate life, so often celebrated as rebellious or even noble, was in many cases nothing more than brutality disguised. For every man who hoisted the black flag in search of release from empire, there were others who used piracy as permission to dominate, to torture, and to kill. And nowhere was this cruelty felt more clearly than in the lives of the boys unlucky enough to cross a pirate's path. These boys, some barely 10 years old, others not yet strong enough to lift their own weight, paid a price no child should ever face. They paid it with their bodies, with their minds, and with their futures. Some were worked until collapse and beaten into silence. Others were thrown into the sea the moment they ceased to be useful. And some endured torments so severe that even the historical record, so fond of soft phrases, refuses to describe them directly. What makes their pain even more haunting is how deliberate it was. These were not accidents of war. The punishments inflicted on these boys were planned, practiced, and delivered with chilling precision. When a pirate captain tied a child to the mast, it was not because the boy was a danger, it was to set an example. When boys were crippled or mutilated, it was not to keep order, it was to spread fear. When they were raped or tortured, it did not happen in the noise of battle, but in the stillness of night, in locked cabins, or on open decks where no one moved to intervene. These were crimes not of survival but of domination. The courts that remembered. Sometimes, when pirate crews were caught and brought to trial, the stories of these boys rose to the surface. Their testimonies, where they exist, remain among the most painful and revealing evidence in the archives. Often brief, yet undeniably raw. In one Boston trial in 1725, a boy named Isaac, only 14, testified against the pirates who had kept him in chains for nearly a year. His account was plain, almost clinical, explaining how he was forced to polish boots, scrub the decks, and beaten whenever he showed fatigue. He told how he was made to laugh at his own humiliation or risk far worse. He spoke of nights shattered by the screams from another boy's quarters. The court records state that Isaac collapsed in tears halfway through his testimony. The trial continued without him. The pirates were executed. Isaac disappeared from history, never mentioned again. In another trial, the boy Thomas Nichols, whose ordeal we have already recounted, stood as the central witness who shattered a pirate crew's defense. His recollection of every blow, every threat, was so precise that even the presiding judge was said to turn pale. His words condemned men who might otherwise have escaped back to the sea, but they could never undo the scars already carved into him. Such trials were uncommon. Much more often, pirate ships vanished beyond the horizon, leaving behind no survivors to testify at all. The myth that still lingers. And still, despite everything uncovered, the legend of the pirate endures. Polished, commercialized, stripped of blood. Children wear pirate costumes at Halloween. Films transform killers into figures of comedy. Theme park rides bring laughter where grief should be. The cruelty pirates inflicted, especially upon the young, has been hidden beneath centuries of retelling. It becomes easy to overlook the cost when all that survives are flags and gold. Yet behind those bright tales of treasure are the real stories of real boys who were seized, beaten, broken, and sometimes lost forever. To remember them does not erase the fascination with pirates. Complicates it. It restores a darker truth to a past that was never meant to be celebrated. It asks uneasy questions about what we glorify and whose voices we leave unspoken. Because history is not only what is remembered, it is also what is forgotten.